Hello guys and welcome back. Now we finally can start to do something on some level, right? But I may have to explain a few things also down the way. So here on the include, I'm gonna create another include. Just type in hash include, right? You can see there's some auto completion. When you see that, you can hit the tab button to commit the suggested auto completion, and then I can just start typing in what do I want to include. In this case, components, and then /, and then we can type in scene component. Okay, now scroll down here to the public part. I'm going to type in ue property parentheses, and this is basically the same as ue class. Ue class means it's an Unreal Engine class, and this means it's an Unreal Engine property, right? And then we're going to create the property of the type use scene component, and then we type in a star here. Okay, and then we're going to say root conf. Okay, and then semicolon to finish that. Okay, so what is this thing? Well, this is something we call a member variable, or in our English term, it's a property, right, of this snakehead. Yeah. So it has two parts. Actually, for a variable, or this is something we call member variable, right, or a property. For one of these things, you'll have three unique parts. Okay. The first thing is its type. In this case, it's of the type scene component, right? And we add a star here, which convert the type from the actual thing into a pointer of that thing. Okay, so what do you mean pointer? Well, the computer memory is where we store our data, right? The memory card. Like when you're buying a new computer, you have a memory card or specification like 32 gigabytes of RAM or 64, sometimes 8 for smaller laptops. But that's going to be the place you store your data, right? And the data there is put or stored like a warehouse. Like every byte of data we use byte as the size, but you don't have to worry about how much is the byte. But just imagine that, it's like a warehouse with a sequence of bytes, aligned in order, right? In order. And every byte in there will have an address, right, where it is in the warehouse. We call that address. Okay. Now this variable that we call pointer, basically is only going to give you an address of a particular byte on your memory card. Okay, the address of a particular byte, and that's unique. Every byte will have a different address, and they're sequentially ordered from 0 to whatever number that is. That sequence in theory or in reality is actually a number, right? So byte number 1, byte number 2, byte number 3, right? So this will give you, or this will store one of the numbers which can lead you to a certain byte, a unique byte on your memory card. Okay, that's what this variable stores. And then the second thing is the name of the variable. Right, in this case, we call it room component, but this is something arbitrary, right? Now, the reason we have to do the include here is because we need to know what this is. This file has to know what this is before you can use it. Now, why does this file have to know it? Because those files are translated individually, right? Every file here is something we call a translation unit, right? When your code is translating into machine code, they will be translated one by one, not all together, right? I think that's because of how hard it is to put everything together before you translate. It's easier to translate every individual ones of them and not worrying about the whole picture, and then you stitch them together, right? There's also something we call compiling first and then linking later on, right? Which, probably won't need to go into detail on how those things are, what those things are. Again, that's something really critical, right? And you have to really learn C++ to know what those things are, right? Went too far, but yeah. So this is the name of the variable. So you have the type of the variable, right, which is a pointer, right, to a certain byte of your memory card. And this also indicates, because we typed in the type, it's a string component, this also indicates that, from that memory on, for the next few memories or next few bytes in your memory, is actually storing something called a scene root component, or a type of scene root component, right? So that's what's going on in there. So this is basically only, saying, okay, this attribute is in here, right? My snake hat has it. To actually create one, we need a third element, which is the value, right? The actual thing that's in there, in that memory address. Okay, to do that, we need to do that in the constructor, which is in the CPP file. So let me go to the CPP file, and then we can start typing in our root component will be equals to create default subobject. Okay, uppercase C. Okay, create default subobject, and then angle brackets, use scene component, and then we can give it an arbitrary name called root comp. Now you can probably are seeing that I'm having a semicolon here. I did the same thing in here, right? So this is the something you have to end at to have at the end of a line, not necessarily the end of the line, but more importantly the end, or more precisely the end of a statement, right? So this is a statement. What it does is it's basically saying we're going to create an attribute or property for class snakehead, right? And it's of the type pointer, and it's pointing to a scene component, right? The first memory address of the scene component. The scene component could be whatever size. This only gives you the first memory address, okay, of the first byte of the whole data that's stored on your memory card. And we give it a name called root component, and here we're actually constructing one here by calling a function called create default subobject. We're telling the function we're creating a scene component. We're giving a nickname called root component, and this one will yield the memory address of the created component, and we pass that over to our root component. So now our root component actually points to an actual memory address on your memory card, and from that memory address on to the next sequence of bytes will store or is storing this created using component. Now be aware that here when we do this, we don't really point to anything that's valid. When we do this, this pointer will point to something we call a null pointer, which is nothing, right? You could make it equals to create default subobject, but that's not recommended. Right, so we don't even able to do that here. But here is basically only declaring, okay, this thing exists, right? I wanted to have this attribute, but it's now not really pointing to anything. This pointer is not pointing to anything valid. Here is when it becomes valid. We are assigning a memory address, right? We created a scene component by calling this function, right? And this function then will then return or give back a actual memory address that's pointing to the first byte of data of this created object on your memory card, and that again is stored in your scene component pointer. Okay, so that's the whole story here. Again, if anything here feels confusing, it is. It is quite confusing, especially for beginners like you have never done programming before. This is overwhelming, right? But I could also just explain this like we create this, we make it equal to that, right? You don't have to understand the detail. I don't explain what a pointer is. I can just tell you to type in the star. But that's the problem. That's the problem that I think, when we're teaching programming, things has to be making more sense. That's better for the long run. But if you really want to be able to follow the tutorial without a lot of confusions, of course I will try to explain, but the best way that you can do it is to study C++ first for 1 or 2 months. Before when you view this, then it's just, oh, that's a pointer. I know what a pointer is. Right now when I'm explaining it while doing the coding, this is difficult. This is really difficult. Anyway, so semicolon here, right, for the end of the statement. Okay, so I probably will be repeating a lot of things here. It just feels like I need to really explain explain it so you know what I'm doing here. Okay. All right. So after that, I need to also give my snake head a model. So I'm going to include another component, and that's going to be of the type static mesh component. Okay. And here what I'm going to do is type in another U property, but this time I don't think I need to really being able to access it. Like, I'm just going to leave it alone. Use static mesh component pointer. Right, this is another pointer. Those two are all pointers. They all hold an memory address, but this one is saying that this memory address should be leading right to a static mesh component that's stored on your memory card. So I'm gonna call this guy snake, or maybe head mesh. Okay, now just following the same trend, this is pointing to nothing. To really make it point to something, we have to assign it with a real thing here, right? So this is going to be what we do here. So head mesh will be equals to create uppercase C, create default sub object, right? And then it's going to be, again, this time it's going to be different. This is going to be a static mesh component. Right, and I just give it the same name as the name of the variable, so it's easier to see that when this is what you see in Blueprint, right? This is what you see in C++. You want them to be the same in this case, but you can make them not the same if you wanted to. Okay. Right now we did some coding, right? 4 lines of code. We created actually 6 lines, right? We created 2 Unreal Engine properties for our snake. One is called the root component, another one is called the head mesh. They're of those 2 different types, and we are creating them here in the constructor, right? Set default values. Now we want to also have a hierarchy. So I'm going to call a function called set root component. Okay, the root component will be our root comp. This is basically saying we're going to make root comp our root of our snake head. Okay, now for the head mesh, we're going to attach it to the root component. So we can say head mesh you can type in a dash and then a angle bracket. Whenever we have a pointer, to access what's in that pointer, we have to use a dash angle bracket thing to draw like a little arrow there, right? And then we can say set up attachment uppercase S, right? We're going to attach it to the root component here. Okay. Right, so now we have a hierarchy. That's the root component, which is the scene component, right? Scene component doesn't have anything visual, but it does have a transform, like a empty folder in Maya or something like that, right? So it's empty, right? And then the head mesh is a static mesh component. It does have a mesh representation, and then we set the root component to be our whole root component of our snake head, and we attach head mesh to the root component, so it's kind of like the child of root component. Okay, now those are all set up. Let me close the engine, because whenever you do constructors, you change things in constructors, you want to restart this. I don't think it's able to reload it properly, right? So you close Unreal Engine, you go to build, and you debug and start without debugging, because we don't really have to debug it yet. This is gonna make it go a little bit faster, right? It's gonna go compile or translate, every file we have into machine code, and then start running our program, which actually runs the editor here. Okay. Now if you go to our C++ class, C graded snake, you can see now we have our snake head. You can drag it to the viewport, right? And you can take a look at the component list. You can see we have a root component, right? We don't see the mesh, right? Because that one, I think it's not available because we don't define it, right? If we want it to be available here, we can say this is going to be visible anywhere. We specify that. This means this property will be visible anywhere, even in the blueprint. So if I close that, and let's see if we can rebuild it right away. We probably don't have to reopen the editor all the time, but in some of the old days we had to do it. I think CryEngine still requires you to do it, but Unreal has this hot reload thing that could be working, but it's not always working. Anyway, let me drag this one in. Now you can see we have now the head mesh visible now, right? And we can even change things. Okay, so you can see there's a layer between Unreal and between Unreal C++ and Blueprint. On the lower level in the C++ set, you can define if you want it to be visible or not, right, underneath Blueprint. Okay. Yeah, so now we have some of the basic things set up. We can now move on to the next video where we start setting up our visuals. Okay, see you next time.